I am not a fan of the MCU's comedy movies, as they are usually one note, the jokes take priority over everything, and the comedy completely overshadows and even steps on the drama and stakes. So aside from the R-rated Deadpool movies, I thought there would never be a PG-13 superhero comedy that I would thoroughly enjoy. Then along came DC's comedy superhero movie, Shazam, by horror director David Sandberg, and lo and behold, this is the first PG-13 superhero movie that managed to seamlessly blend the comedy with a great balance of heart, drama, and most surprisingly of all, horror. It all came together incredibly well and has only gotten better the more I see it. Now Shazam 2 Fury of the Gods has been released, but how does it compare to the first movie? And is it deserving of the Rotten Tomato score after the first film's fresh score? We are about to find out. Let the battle commence. The core story for the first Shazam is that Billy Batson was separated from his mother when he was a child, and after begrudgingly spending years in the foster care system and even being taken in by a new family, Billy is convinced that he is not an orphan and that his mother is out there, and he intends to find her so they can reunite and be a happy family again. Or so he thinks. So as well as having a villain in the mix, the movie's core is all about family. The family that Billy is searching for and the family that have taken him in, who are also all orphans. This is such a new and original story that we have not seen in, well, ever, as far as I know, and the adopted parents and kids are actually genuinely nice people, which is also something that we have never seen before. Usually the parents can be incredibly mean or only want to have the foster kids for ulterior motives, but not here. The whole family love each other and the couple that adopted them were also foster kids themselves. That adds such a tragic yet wonderful layer over all these characters. And the foster family element is so well done, it really makes the movie. If it was Marvel, they would have made fun of being a foster kid, just like they made fun of having stage 4 cancer.
It's not that serious.
Jane, it's stage 4.
I have like, how many stages?
4.
That we know about.
But DC and David Sandberg realize that this is a very serious and delicate subject matter, and they approach it with the utmost respect. And they have such confidence that they don't try to soften the blow with a cheap laugh, or a cutaway like in Falcon and the Winter Soldier's hallway confession scene. And the story for Shazam 2 is that the daughters of Atlas have arrived so they can take back the powers from the Shazam kids and recover it for themselves. Meanwhile, Billy and his siblings have to balance their personal lives with their superhero lives, and although they have these powers and use them to save people, it doesn't mean they know how to best use them, and as a result, the city has turned against them and see them as causing more damage than good. This is an excellent concept, and one that doesn't get much more in the way of development, unfortunately. In addition to this, Billy is a few months away from turning 18 and fears that his adopted family will no longer have the financial means to support and keep him now that he no longer brings monetary benefits. And the idea that he might lose another family and be on his own again is hanging over his head in addition to the dangers that are coming his way. Now right off the bat, the first thing I love about the story for both of these Shazam movies is the emotional core at the center of them. Both films are comedies, but they never lose sight of the personal drama, and both of them lead to an emotional scene that really tugged at my heartstrings. And the emotional center behind the whole movie is really what makes these two superhero films special and stand out from the rest of the superhero comedies out there. The only thing I will say against the second movie in this regard is that the first movie focused on it more, whereas Shazam 2 has it, but I really wish it spent more time on it, because when it did talk about it, it was so good, but then it was over. Like there's one point in the movie where all the kids say,
"Bye, Mom."
Bye, Mom.
Bye, Mom.
and Billy's like,
Bye, Rosa.
which genuinely saddens her a little. And then there's a really heartwarming scene later where he calls her mom before he goes to save the day. That was such a great moment, but I wish they would have explored it more and given it more of a build-up. That way, the payoff would have been all the more effective. But that being said, I love the contrast between the two movies. How Billy's real mother didn't want to keep him and his adopted mother did. I honestly thought that was a beautiful contrast which really made this adopted family even more likable than they already were. I mean seriously, when do you see a family dynamic like this in a superhero movie? You don't. The comedy is also great in both films, and it never relies on just one type of joke. It constantly switches them up and gives them a ton of variety, and they never overstay their welcome. I would say that 90% of the humor made me laugh in both of these movies, and as silly as some of the jokes get, they never cross over into becoming ridiculous. And that's another thing I really love about the comedy in the Shazam movies, and the comedy will come to a complete halt to tell its core story with dignity and heart, whereas the competition will do the complete opposite. Shazam, on the other hand, takes the serious approach and treats its sensitive moments with grace and maturity. And I like how in Shazam 2, Billy has fully embraced being part of the family and actually feels like one of them now, whereas in the first movie, he always felt like the outsider as he kept trying to find his biological mother father and never wanted to commit himself to his foster family. And I thought these emotional arcs of the movie were handled incredibly well. Now, as for problems with the story for both films, well, in Shazam 2, the pacing wasn't as good as the pacing in the first movie. It's not that the movie was slow, but there were a couple scenes that would cut a bit too hastily, and the movie felt like it was struggling a bit to balance its plot points and subplots, whereas I thought it managed to perfectly balance them in the first film. And that's largely because it spends a lot of time with the kids adjusting to life as superheroes. And that's part of their character development in this movie and something that definitely needs its time, but I think more time being allocated to the core of the movie, that being Billy fearing that he would lose this family and be alone again, would have added more emotionally to the overall film. And that is kind of what I think that is missing. Whereas the balance between superhero and family was incredibly well distributed in Shazam 1, it felt like a bit was missing in the sequel. So although I like the stories for both of these movies, the movie with the superior story is the first Shazam. All of the action in the first Shazam felt quite small scale, almost like we were watching a superhero action scene in an indie movie. And I mean that in the best way. There was a charm to how small scale it was. The fight between Savannah and Shazam was the best action scene in my opinion, and seeing Billy have to fix his own mistake with the bus was also amusing. The same with watching him unlock his flying ability, which was also really fun and rewarding to see. Really, the action in this movie is very well done, if not a bit basic. You can tell that director David Sandberg is new to this kind of grand-scale filmmaking, and for his first time, this is a really damn good attempt, even if it is small scale. And that's where we get into the second movie, and everything gets bigger, and even the smaller action scenes were done with more energy. I was surprised at how much I enjoyed the bridge scene, and the I Need a Hero song fits so well, and is the best utilization of the song since Shrek 2. I was even surprised at how much I enjoyed the big-scale action scenes with the dragon. When I saw these in the trailer, I couldn't help but feel a little skeptical that this would just be a generic action sequence, but it ended up being a lot of fun. The effects looked much improved over the ones we saw in the trailer, which is not common with superhero movies nowadays. I'm looking at you, Marvel. And the use of lightning during the final battle was spectacular, and watching him use the word Shazam was so satisfying, especially during battles. I do wish that they could utilize that word a lot more during the fight combat though. I feel like there is something very unique there, and they really need to try to take more advantage of it. So I like the action in both movies, and in all accounts, the action is definitely better in Shazam 2. But I gotta say, watching Dr. Savannah fight our inexperienced hero along with the demons was just more of a fun threat to me. And Billy's downright inexperience and childlike instincts to run away from a fight made the action sequences very different from traditional superhero action scenes, and I really appreciated that. And although the action with the Sisters of Atlan is definitely fun, I still think that the movie with the superior action is Shazam 1. But once you factor in the action scenes with the dragon, I enjoyed this so freaking much, and the way the music built up to this climax, it was really epic. Especially if you saw it in theaters or with a good sound system at home. So Shazam 1 was so close, but because of that epic dragon fight in the climax, the movie with the superior action is Shazam 2. Despite being a comedy and drama, Shazam can also be a horror film at times. The fantastical elements of this movie are presented with a lot of suspense and tension, which is very similar to that of a horror film. These include the opening scene of young Dr. Savannah, the monsters that threaten to kill children, and of course, let's not forget about these two scenes. I mean, jeez. When watching this in the theater, I expected the camera to cut away as soon as the demon bit the guy's head. But no, they show it to you. All this needed was a bit of blood, and this movie could have gotten an R rating. That's how close they got. It really is amazing how this is not a straightforward comedy. Not only does it have serious drama, but it also has horror. Horror that is sure to give nightmares to little kids in the audience, which is exactly what happened to previous generations of kids with movies like Indiana Jones, The Goonies, and Gremlins, etc. And Shazam took direct inspiration from the horror moments in those Amblin movies. This took people by surprise so pleasantly that even Kevin Feige over at the MCU realized, so you can add more tones to your comedies aside from just comedy. And a few months after this movie, Kevin Feige suddenly decided that Doctor Strange 2 would have horror scenes in it. And after years of making comedies, it's no coincidence that he suddenly decided to utilize horror just a few months after Shazam came out. It's especially funny as he even verbatim took director David Sandberg's reason for including horror scenes in the first place.
How did you decide how much horror to put in, especially with the 7 Deadly Sins?
Well, just a little bit. I mean, to me, this was my chance to do the kind of movie that I grew up with and loved and made me fall in love with movies.
Yeah.
You know, like Gremlins or Ghostbusters, and Goonies
Right.
was a big inspiration, like early Amblin movies and things like that. Because a lot of those movies have, you know, they're like a fun sense of adventure, but they also have like real stakes. And, you know, those were the kinds of movies that I loved as a kid, like Raiders of the Lost Ark, which is like, yeah, fun adventure, but then you have people's faces melting and it's like, ooh, a little scared.
Multiverse of Madness, it'll be a big MCU film with scary sequences in it. The way, when I was a kid in the 80s, Spielberg did an amazing job. I mean, there are horrifying sequences in Raiders that I would say when I was a little kid and do this when their faces melted. Or Temple of Doom, of course, or Gremlins, or Poltergeist.
He also stated that he loved Aquaman, and shortly after, Wakanda Forever was said to have an underwater city. I'm not saying it's a bad thing that Kevin Feige wanted to copy all of this stuff from DC, as competition always makes for better products in the end. But this just goes to show that Shazam actually made a real splash in the superhero comedy genre, and it was very well incorporated into the movie as well as the villains. And then we have the horror in Shazam 2, and although it wasn't as strong as the horror in the first movie, it was still damn good to see. Some of the monsters actually look like horror creatures, they all had an edge to them, and they actually had suspenseful build-up like horror creatures would. They also killed a bunch of people on screen, and some of their designs, especially this one, looked like something that nightmares are made of. Well, aside from this one maybe. The monsters all had a sadistic twist to them and didn't feel like generic comic book monsters. I even liked the build-up of the unicorns, which were not the usual whimsical creatures that we know them to be. There was even a scene where someone had to pull a very long splinter out of their fingernail, and that was bordering on body horror. What makes it even worse is that it's a practical effect, and you see it in detail as he slowly takes the wood out of his finger. Speaking of wood, I like how the dragon was created with the Tree of Life. I have never seen a dragon like that before, and its CGI looked very shaky in the trailers, but in the final movie, I was surprised at how badass it looked, and it really integrated very nicely into the shots, and even the dragon was built up like a horror monster. So both movies handle the horror incredibly well, and it really comes down to personal preference, but I personally thought that the horror in Shazam 1 was much more hardcore and shocking, whereas Shazam 2's horror did feel a bit watered down to me. So in my opinion, the Shazam movie that has the superior horror is the first Shazam. In Shazam 1, our villain is Dr. Savannah, who is possessed and empowered by the 7 deadly sins. Once he actually becomes the villain, his introduction is so memorable and really establishes him as a big threat. And it's very rare that we have comic book villains, in comedies no less, that have such a big horrific impact with their first scene. And Mark Strong plays this role so well. The only downside is that once he achieves his goal of attaining his power and then kills his brother and father, his motivation feels kind of done. After that, he just wants to face off against the other champion that the wizard has given his powers to, so he can no longer be defeated. Not a bad motivation, but it is a bit more generic when compared to his other. But overall, I thought Mark Strong as Dr. Savannah was a great villain to start Shazam off with, and then to potentially have him return in the future. And in Shazam Fury of the Gods, we have the Daughters of Atlas. Unlike Dr. Savannah, these are original villains that were never in any of the Shazam comics. And they are quite generic comic book villains, however, they do have enough different elements to them that makes them more unique than you would expect. I like how you don't just have the 2 evil sisters and the 1 sister that is just good. You have all 3 sisters that are different. Even Helen Mirren is evil, but has limits to her cruelty, and that makes her less generic. And the way she lays out her motivation and personal vendetta to Shazam, that was both funny and understandable at the same time. So much so that even Billy didn't know how to respond to that. So Helen Mirren did a great job as the villain. Lucy Liu's character on the other hand just hates all of humanity and is accused by Helen Mirren as having more of her Uncle Hades attitude in her rather than their father's. And again, she could have been more of a generic villain, but little touches like her constant moral disagreements with Helen Mirren did elevate her and make her feel a bit less generic. And her power of demonic persuasion really was freaky and horror-like in its execution, and you are just rooting for Shazam to kick her ass. Now, even though these villains are good, especially for being original villains that are from Greek mythology, I do think that Black Adam should have been the villain for the second movie. That would have been the next big step forward, because Black Adam to Shazam is what Joker is to Batman. He's Shazam's main villain, but Dwayne Johnson clearly didn't give a flying shit about Shazam and clearly wanted to distance himself as far away from the Shazam movies as possible, just so he could have his WWE match with Superman. I mean, his inclusion would have made this a much heavier movie with even higher stakes, but The Rock's ego got in the way of all that, and he clearly wasn't a team player. So in that regard, I'm glad that Black Adam failed. And part of that blame I do put on Dwayne Johnson for ignoring the Shazam franchise, which is where his character belongs. He could have appearances outside of that, but he's a Shazam character, and he wanted to turn DC into a mindless WWE battle arena. So it's a good thing that he's no longer in this universe, because he would not have made it realize its full potential. So yeah, I like the villains in both films, but by the end, I got a lot more satisfaction, entertainment, and threat with Dr. Savannah and the 7 Deadly Sins. They were just so much more evil, demonic, and I genuinely feared for our character so much whenever he was around, and he just had more of an entertaining presence around him. Whereas the threat level for these three was there, but they just felt like side villains rather than main villains. Not to mention that Mark Strong was a lot more memorable in my opinion. So good villains in both movies, but the movie with the superior villain is the first Shazam. As you can tell, I clearly love both of these movies, and coming from me, that is no easy feat, because like I said, I have not been liking any of these PG-13 comedies over the last several years from Marvel, and David Sandberg ended up making 2 PG-13 superhero comedies in a row that I really liked, and that's largely because they actually aspire to be more than just comedies. They are movies that have a strong emotional core with superhero elements thrown in, of course, but the superhero stuff never loses focus on the element of family, and they managed to do that with foster kids no less. Aside from Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends, I have never seen a house of orphans get along so well. And I love the contrast of how in the first movie, Billy was a loner who mostly tried to keep to himself, and in the second movie, he is the one that tries to keep him and his siblings together. The rule that he came up with, in fact, is
all or none. That's the rule.
As far as problems go, I don't really have any with the first Shazam, and any that I did have, I can easily overlook. As for the second Shazam, I have three problems. One is that Billy Batson and Shazam both act very different. In their first scene, they both act the same, but after the opening bridge scene, that's when their personalities didn't match at all. Second is the score. Most of it was good, but the new main theme was infinitely inferior when compared to the fantastic main theme in the first film. The MCU movies are guilty of switching out main themes in their sequels, and I'm actually surprised that this was allowed to happen with Shazam 2. The new theme is much more generic, and I really want to know why they couldn't just reuse and expand on the original one. And my third, final, and biggest problem with Shazam Fury of the Gods is that we needed more of it. The first Shazam was primarily about Billy and the search for his mother whilst he simultaneously discovers this new power, and we constantly switch from his perspective to Dr. Savannah's, and the movie feels very contained and tightly paced as a result. With Shazam 2, it's not just about Billy. It spends dedicated time and opens up subplots with other characters, and all of these things are very good, and to David Sandberg's credit, he juggles and gives purpose to his several characters better than any of the recent MCU films have, but it leaves you wanting more. For example, it said that the heroes have been rejected by the city. That no longer makes the movie feel contained. It opens up the world, and that makes the viewer want to see that part of the world and what impact it may have on our heroes. But aside from the odd reference, it's never talked about again. Also, it is said that Billy is nearly reaching 18 and is afraid of being dropped from the foster system and what that will mean for him in his current foster family. And as I said earlier, I really would have liked to have seen that play out a bit more, and it would have made the emotional payoff all the more effective, like it did with the search for his mother in the first film. Anthea was a great addition to these characters, and I found her relationship with Freddy to be very charming, but I would have liked to see their relationship develop and blossom more before the big betrayal happens. That would have made it feel all the more impactful. So all of these things and more are done very well in the movie, but I really wish we got more time given to them. Now that would undoubtedly extend the movie's runtime to about 2 hours and 20 to 2 hours and 30 minutes, but I think that extra time would have really given some more meat to these plot points, and they would have been even better and more impactful with more time. And that's what Shazam Fury Fury of the Gods really needed was more time. And that's what the first Shazam has over the second. Everything that we want to see is given the perfect amount of time, and it leaves you feeling very satisfied in the end. It's time for the scores. Shazam 1 is a fantastic film, and it only gets better and better the more times I see it. And it gets a very high 8 out of 10. And Shazam Fury of the Gods gets a 7. Oh, and Wonder Woman is utilized in the end of Shazam 2, and I thought it was a cool bonus, but I'm relieved that this was allowed to be a Shazam movie and that she showed up right towards the end when the movie was over. That being said, Gal Gadot's acting is a far cry from what it used to be. I mean, really, her acting has just taken a nosedive recently. Anyway, I thoroughly enjoyed both of these movies, and that is a huge compliment coming from me. Both of the Shazam films are special. They have so much heart, creative jokes and humor, and they have a director that knows what he's doing and has both hands on the wheel. And I think David Sandberg has put such a huge creative stamp on his Shazam movies, and I will be really sad if he doesn't end up making more. And if anyone else takes his place, they have an incredibly high bar to meet. Again, the fact that I actually have not one, but 2 comedic PG-13 superhero movies that I thoroughly enjoyed, that cannot be overstated enough. And if David Sandberg does not return to Shazam, I would at least hope that he stays on as producer and monitors this character going forward. Thank you very much, David Sandberg. I will forever have these 2 movies in my collection. Now go and make another horror movie, and me and my brothers will be there on day 1 to see it. A big thanks to all of my patrons for continuing to support me. At the time of recording this, we have now reached our 50 Patreon milestone. The next milestone will be 100, and then I will continue production on my How to Train Your Dragon 3-way versus video. And yes, the Hogwarts Legacy Steam Deck content will be on my Patreon within the next couple of days, so keep your eyes open for that. And you'll hear my thoughts on the game thus far, and how it runs on the Steam Deck, as well as how I got to stop it from lagging at a certain point once we start getting the broomsticks. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I really do appreciate it. Please do give the video a thumbs up, as the YouTube algorithm really seems to like that, and I will catch all of you very soon. Take care.